This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
Hey, everybody. Welcome into another edition of the Bartholomew Town Podcast. It's Bill Bartholomew here with you, as today we have a very relevant discussion, something that is, frankly, right in our faces here as a state, as a region, and really as a world, I guess. But specifically here in Providence and the issues surrounding environmental racism in the capital city. Now, sometimes this makes its way to the forefront of our media discussion when we're talking mostly in the context of protests, right? Or in the context of, there was a fire at the submarine that's off Allen's Avenue, and then that'll kind of spark a discussion of, well, shouldn't we clean up that shorefront area and improve the just the general well-being of the city in doing so? But there are systemic issues that tie into and intersect with a number of other major topics that we discuss here on the podcast and in general in conversation, but are specifically related to the context of environmental racism. Julia Murphy is a recent graduate of Providence College and now a legislative aide in Massachusetts. And she recently did an outstanding in-depth report on not only the specifics of environmental racism in Providence, but the factors surrounding them, the institutions of power that really help to maintain a lot of things that on the surface, again, just kind of like right in front of our faces, we should all be able to go, yeah, that's not right. We need to change that immediately. And it's very interesting, as you'll hear in our conversation here on B-Town, just exactly how much of a role everything from, or everyone from, the media to elected officials to community leaders all play in this discussion and where we can make changes rapidly. I think we oftentimes, when we get into issues that are, not like news stories, like, oh, this happened this week and we're going to follow up on it and get some specific details, maybe break a little bit of news, whatever it is. But like the broader conversations that we have here on the pod from time to time, a lot of times when we think about solutions, they seem so daunting. They seem so far off in the future. And in this case, maybe it is, but it certainly doesn't have to be. And there are factors that we can make adjustments to that, as I allude to in the interview you're about to hear, they don't cost any money. You don't need a bloated nonprofit infrastructure to analyze and make changes on and so on and so forth. You don't need any of that. Not to say that the nonprofit sector isn't doing excellent work in this area, or that, that it doesn't help to bolster this. But there are just specific changes we can make the same way that you would update a Google Calendar invite and just change the location of certain meetings, for example, that could help to elevate the voices of people who are in the community that is being impacted. And for this discussion to make its way to City Hall and to the State House and into the private sector in a meaningful way that raises the credibility, or perceived credibility, I should say, and status as expert of those who live in the community, and at least pairs it against, in an even fashion, an even-handed fashion, the status and expertise or perceived expertise of individuals who come from or are spokespeople for the private sector industries that are creating a lot of these challenges. Basically making the community stakeholders equal and as relevant as any spokesperson or any expert from an industry. So a lot here today. Remember, follow me on Twitter, Instagram, now TikTok, which that is getting off the charts already. I don't know what I'm doing over there. I did a video the other day where I was looked like a candy corn dancing around. I'm going to try to start doing some funny Rhode Island politics stuff. That's the whole point of that. So I'm over on TikTok, the Bartholomew Town Podcast Facebook group. And of course, for exclusive content and to help sustain this program, simply head to patreon.com/BartholomewTown or click the support link wherever you're listening right now.
My name is Julia Murphy. I'm a recent graduate of Providence College. Graduated back in May with a minor in public and community service studies and a major in political science. Originally from the Berkshires out in Western Mass, but currently working in Boston as a legislative aide in the House of Representatives. But I conducted my senior thesis for my work at Providence on environmental justice and environmental racism in the greater Providence community. I kind of entered into the project with an interest in discriminatory housing policies and how that kind of parlays into, manifestations of environmental racism. But as the project kind of grew and evolved, it became much more focused on kind of the power structures that serve as barriers to traditionally marginalized communities who are organizing in pursuit of environmental justice, right? So we have this kind of dynamic of, siting of environmentally hazardous projects in close proximity to neighborhoods that are often predominantly minority, predominantly low income, and, don't speak English as their first language. But I wanted to get into what happens when those communities try to fight back against these proposals. So that's what I did. I focused on the case of the 2015 National Grid proposal to build a massive liquefied natural gas site at the Fields Point kind of terminal, which is a down in, I believe, off the shore, kind of in Providence, and wanted to see how that impacted the community, both from an environmental racism standpoint, but also, again, focusing on what they did to kind of stop the proposal in its tracks. So that's kind of what happened. That's how it evolved. And I found some really interesting things through that work.
Yeah, and I'd love to get into the specifics of your findings because it's so relevant to the broader discussion that we have today, just on, really generic term, but equity. When we think of Providence, and particularly when we think of the southern portions of the city, the southern neighborhoods, South Providence, Washington Park, even Elmwood, West Elmwood, whatever it may be, there is so much that can be identified as examples of environmental racism. I mean, just look at the asthma rates, for example, in certain neighborhoods, Washington Park, on a national scale, what that is all about. But this is also nothing that is especially new here. When we look back on the history, I'm sitting now in Elmwood, just steps away from a mashbog pond, which at one point was a fertile, vibrant ecosystem that became a dumping ground for a silversmith here, the Gorham Silver Company. To this day, it is basically hazardous to approach Mashbog Pond, and the surrounding areas are forever changed. There's also the conversation around transportation that intersects here, where highways were built right through West Elmwood, and you can make an argument that there's an environmentally racist aspect to all of that as well. But in your specific findings, what did you come across? What was most alarming to you? What jumped out and said, okay, this case study 2015 demonstrates what is sort of visible on the surface, but gets into the weeds and sort of exposes the details?
Right. Yeah. So I think, my initial focus, I knew that I wanted to kind of conduct like a mixed methods project, in the sense of I wanted to hear straight from the voices of community members who were directly not only impacted, but also directly involved in the organizing efforts against the LNG project. So that was where the qualitative part came in. I wanted to talk to them. I wanted to hear from people on the ground, get a sense of, not only how was this project kind of brought to their attention, but what was the process like when they went to public hearings, when they reached out to elected officials. So that was kind of one side of it. I also did a news content analysis. So I wanted to see, because as we know, media, especially on the local level, is such a critical tool for organizers. How much attention is their cause getting? It's essential for media coverage to bring in people who might not be direct stakeholders, but can, support their efforts. So it was kind of twofold in that sense. But I guess focusing on the interviews first, I was able to talk to, COVID did kind of put a damper on just the accessibility of getting in touch with people. But I spoke with Monica Huertas, who is honestly probably the best person I could have talked to. She's a Washington Park resident, and really emerged as the lead organizer for the No LNG and PVD campaign. I spoke with her and Wasa Bagayoko, who was a recent Brown grad, but she kind of worked with the community as an advocate through her, I think it was called Rhode Island Students Against Fossil Fuels. So she actually attended public hearings, kind of served as a liaison for the community. But what was really interesting in those interviews was hearing about the barriers that they encountered when they kind of engaged in the democratic process as one should when they're trying to bring an issue to the attention of decision makers, right? So I think looking at kind of the conditions of the public hearings is the best way to explain just the general dynamic that was happening of really intentionally excluding the community members from this decision and kind of from the narrative. So a couple of examples with that that come to mind are the location of the hearings that were held. A couple were held at correctional facilities with high levels of security. So looking at the demographic of the community, people were concerned about their immigration status being questioned, or, just security in general when it's that abrasive kind of makes it a very unwelcoming environment that disincentivizes people to want to speak, tell their story, talk about what's going on. So kind of almost naturally deterring them away from it. Not to mention, looking at people who might work multiple jobs. They can't afford to sit in a 5-hour hearing and, figure out who's going to take care of their kids. So oftentimes kids were brought in to the hearings, and just the language barrier, right? No effort by, the relevant agencies to have a translator there. So people are really put in an uncomfortable position, and I would also say an unfair position, because public hearings by nature are supposed to, incorporate the public and give them a chance that they might not otherwise have to have their concerns heard to the people who are mitigating and making these decisions. So that was really interesting, and I think it speaks to issues that we see in kind of just the local democratic process. I think it's also applicable at all levels, but really, not giving the people who are being affected a seat at the table. And I learned through my conversation with them, with the folks involved. They said, yeah, a seat at the table would be great, but even when we're given those seats, we're not really being heard. We're not being listened to. So we talk about equity. It's like, all right, maybe we bring in a community member to check a box, but what if there's really nothing in place for them to actually be listened to and to have them involved in some kind of decision making? So that was really fascinating. Honestly, pretty discouraging to hear what they had gone through, because they organized an incredible campaign against this. They did, pooling all their resources. They did so much with what they had, not to mention the barriers that they faced when they finally got to the people who were saying, we're going to build this. And then their concerns were just dismissed and kind of, I guess, not taken seriously was the inclination that I got. But when we look at the news side of things, just the sheer lack of coverage that local outlets kind of gave to this massive issue. So I looked at that as one part of the analysis, but the other was looking at how often the voices of certain stakeholders were included when they did get coverage about this issue. And there was a really stark contrast between how much community members were included in this coverage and folks from National Grid or different governmental agencies. It was really jarring. And again, a massive barrier for the folks who were trying to organize against this cause, because they just weren't given the attention, and kind of their side of the narrative wasn't being told at all, especially in comparison to the rhetoric that was being put out by National Grid. This is a great project. It'll create jobs, all this stuff. The negative aspect was really not covered in the degree that I think that it should have been.
Lots to get into there. Yeah. Well, first of all, amazing work. I mean, I did have a chance to review your materials. It's phenomenal. And I want to start with the latter portion of what we just discussed with respect to the media. And I think that this is a common situation. In fact, I know it's a common situation in a lot of issues that pertain to, without, I guess, with lack of a better term, marginalized communities. And this isn't in and of itself an indictment on the humans that work in media here in Rhode Island. In some cases, it may be. Decision makers are actively ignoring this stuff, largely, I think, because of their target audiences. If you look at television news, right, frankly, it's a suburban, older audience, so on and so forth. But there are people in this community who are in news that do tend to sweep this stuff under the rug or look to the economic development side of things and weigh that more heavily in terms of voices and in terms of the impact, if you will, that a story would have. And that is where I think the problem really lies. And I think you hit something really important there, because we saw this in COVID where, frankly, from my perspective and being in the COVID briefings every day and the discussions around that, especially in the earlier months, I was constantly asking, what's the data based on zip codes, not by city, but what's the data based on zip codes? How can we extrapolate that data and compare it to access to community health centers or transportation issues, workforce, or the requirement for a particular community to likely have to go into a factory scenario or a scenario that is simply impossible to do work from home? All of these types of questions are really, really important. And I make the argument when I speak to a statewide audience or regional audience on any of these platforms, the podcast or the radio stuff I do or whatever, TV stuff, that what happens in Providence affects the entire state. Like, it doesn't matter even if you live on Block Island, in Westerly, Charlestown, Burrillville, whatever, it's a city state. We may as well just be known as Providence. If you think about Google Maps and like clicking around, if you're an alien looking at Rhode Island, it's all one region and it's certainly all one community here. So when we have these major issues, such as environmental racism that's ongoing, it does impact on a very practical and human level everybody in the state. So it's worth bringing that to everyone's attention. It's not like, over there, and you'll hear this, in South Providence, don't go there because you're going to get shot or stabbed, or some guy's going to come up on a dirt bike and run you over. And a lot of that is just pure ignorance, and a lot of it is sometimes steeped in hatred. But the lack of media coverage on this and the lack of voices from the community and the way those voices are portrayed, oftentimes they are portrayed as, all right, grab somebody who lives in this neighborhood and get an opinion, versus the expertise that the industry provides, whether it's Grid or anyone else. Whereas the expertise arguably comes from the stakeholders that are in the community. And the people who are oftentimes presented as experts are, in fact, people who have no expertise on the specifics of the community. That dichotomy is so dangerous, and it's something that we've got to correct. And I think it's part of the reason why there's this rift in news media right now, that, never mind the Trump media is fake stuff, where people just don't really care or watch media. They would rather talk to people in their communities or listen for voices in their community that can guide them in a direction in terms of formulating their own opinions. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I think that the point about expertise is so important, right? Because even, in the decision by the Federal Commission on Energy Regulation and the people who eventually said, we're going to go ahead with this project, even though we've heard the opposition from the community, even though we know that it's going to severely impact them, we're going to go ahead with it anyway. And I think all you have to do to really see kind of the lack of expertise from those folks is to look at their rationale when they said, we're going to go ahead. They specifically said, we didn't feel like the historical aspect and the historical impact of pollution in this neighborhood was enough ground for us to base this decision on. Well, I'm sure that the people in the community would argue that that's all you needed to base the decision on, right? Like, they've been targets of environmental racism and just pollution and degradation for generations due to the proximity of their neighborhood to the Fields Point terminal, but also because there's this kind of underlying theme where people making these siting decisions, they think that they'll encounter the least opposition in these marginalized neighborhoods to begin with. So that's why it makes it a more appealing place in the first place. But going back to their rationale, I thought that was incredibly jarring. How can you not look at the historical impacts of pollution in a neighborhood when you're going to put a huge polluter on top of that, right? Like, we're just adding to the cycle we're building. So, they didn't do their homework, or they chose to ignore a really significant aspect of this whole situation, because in the public hearings you have clips and you have quotes from from community members. My child has asthma. If we have a bad air day, like I know that they can't go to school and I have to take off time from work. And like, this is something that could actually kill us. Like this is, because we've been dealing with it, and this would just be possibly the straw that breaks the camel's back. So for them, again, the agency is making these choices to kind of choose to ignore the historical side of things and just the history of what the neighborhood has already endured, kind of cites exactly what you were saying.
It's wacky, and it's like B-Town. This episode is brought to you by Elmwood Songwriters Club, presented by B-Town. It's a monthly showcase featuring 7 artists from all around the region. With the order drawn at random, each artist performs 2 songs. You can find details about when the next event is here in Providence by following me on Twitter and Instagram at Bill Bartholomew. You mentioned a great point. A child has asthma. Okay, you may not be able to draw a straight line from the neighborhood a person lives in to the fact that that person has asthma. But when you look at the broad data, you can pretty much, call an ace, a spade, common sense. There's something going on. And then when you take a step back and you realize, all right, in a bad air day or any other situation, that person can't go to school. Now you have someone who has to stay home. Even if you're not willing to accept the human casualty, which you should, it's morally the right thing to do, to be like, wow, this is wrong. We got to correct this. It seems like that doesn't work for some people, and especially some people who are in situations of influence and power. Then accept the fact that Providence is going around in circles, has been for decades, in terms of its educational infrastructure and its workforce. And in order for this state to grow in a practical, long-term economic context, you've got to have an educated and engaged student population and an educated and engaged workforce. And until we get there, we're not going to have, these big swing for the fences type companies come in or ideas come in. So it's like on both sides of this argument, or both perspectives supporting the work that you have done, it would seem like just total common sense that, okay, you know what? We can't do this. We can't do these type of projects because it's going to guaranteed have a negative impact in the long term in the city on a multitude of levels, even if you're willing to dismiss the suffering of certain people because of a classist view of reality.
Yeah. And I think just, tapping into the human side was, arguably what I consider the most important part of this project. But again, understanding like how it might be received, I felt like the hard news data was important to kind of say, no, this isn't just how people were feeling. This is what actually is happening. Here are the numbers, right? Like they just said, they weren't saying, oh, we didn't feel included. They were actually not being included from media coverage. Like there's tangible evidence to back that up. But I think you're absolutely right. It's like, how do we, shift our thinking about things if we're not willing to look at the whole picture? And I think what's striking about this, and I knew this going into this work, was this isn't a new phenomena. They did, there was a similar case, I believe, in 2004, where the community was actually successful in opposing a similar kind of polluting project. But obviously, the findings and the rationale behind that decision weren't really taken into account in this one. And there's not much difference in terms of the magnitude and effect. So, why was this approved and that one wasn't? And it's like, what for the community members, I can't speak for them, but I can only imagine how discouraging that must be to not really, to do the same kind of organizing, to the same kind of outreach, and have one effort be successful and one not. But at the end of the day, regardless of you opposed one project, you still have another one. The harm and the propensity for dangerous impact is still there. So I think it's almost this dangerous cycle of how do we break out of that? How do we bring community members to the table and maybe listen to them a little bit more so that we can talk about, like cleaning up the Fields Point area. They have ideas, right? They're living through this. It's not like they just don't like this and want it stopped. They have ideas on how we can make it better for everyone who lives there and who lives around it. And I think that that's kind of a part of the conversation that gets lost. It's one thing to be upset about decisions. It's another to come to the table with solutions and concrete ideas for action. but they have to be welcomed by decision makers in the first place. And from my understanding and from my, my research, that that wasn't the case here, which is upsetting on a lot of levels, but mostly for the community members who are living through this on a daily basis. Definitely.
And just the anecdotes that you mentioned with respect to having these meetings at correctional facilities. And I mean, number one, it's tone deaf. Number two, it is creating barriers and exclusivity. It's much like what we saw with the COVID tests at the beginning of COVID-19, where, members of certain portions of our community were hesitant to go to the Community College of Rhode Island, pull into the parking lot, be greeted by military garbed figures, National Guards people who, were there with good intention. And there really was no, there certainly wasn't any, immigration status verification happening or anything like that. But nonetheless, there's a distrust. And based on some of the actions we've seen over the years, of a valid distrust for that. And I remember the first time I went to get a COVID test, I was like shaking. You got guys and like, the mask is like camouflage pulled up over their face. You're thinking, man, I got nothing to worry about here. And that barrier is so significant. And we need that to be understood by stakeholders and decision makers in the community. And not necessarily in the community, but people at the state or municipal level who are engaging these types of discussions, like just common sense, like think about it. And when you don't think about it and you just keep moving along, you widen the rift and you create situations where there will be more and more disparity. And all the rhetoric, all the speeches, all the ARPA dollars given to some nonprofit's going to give it out to this person and pay high salaries and, pull in Mercedes-Benz into the parking lot of the nonprofit that they're supposed to be. All that doesn't mean anything, but moving these types of meetings into a church or into a community center, offering translation, transportation, if necessary, all these types of things, that will go far. That doesn't cost any money at all.
Right.
And it's just like, it's mind boggling. And it just, I cannot understand how we've gotten into this spot. One question, have you found examples of other similar situations on a national basis where communities are aggressively targeted for these types of projects, largely ignored, but then are able to organize and rise against the political machine that's pushing them back and make significant changes in terms of planning or rebounding from projects?
That's a great question. I think, this project is something that if I had more than a year to complete it, I think that the possibilities of just extending the findings would have been really limitless. So that is kind of an area that I touch on in my conclusion, since I obviously wasn't able to continue. I had to graduate. But my gut instinct is that this dynamic is very applicable to cities like Providence across the country. I even think of Boston and the South Shore, not 100% positive in terms of have they been able to actually infiltrate the political machine. But I know that this dynamic is happening, in the South. I've read a ton of articles about, even in Flint, like Flint still doesn't have clean water to drink. We look at environmental racism has unfortunately become a household term, but for good reason. And it's because it's happening everywhere. Even Pittsfield, a small town where I'm from in Western Mass, we had, a massive GE plant and there was PCBs in the water and they're still not cleaned up decades later. So to answer your question, I haven't gotten to the point of seeing what, has anyone actually been able to organize and make a change? But I think that's worth exploring, not only because I think it would provide a lot of communities hope that are experiencing this, but also just maybe open people's minds that, hey, change isn't a bad thing when it comes to kind of the way we've been doing this. Let's bring people to the table. Let's meet people where they are. Like you said, it comes down to intentionality. When people are making these decisions and designing these massive projects that have the propensity to pollute neighborhoods, it's not difficult to meet people where they are. and bring those people into the conversation. I think we see it in so many different occasions, even on like a more political scheme, right? Like the Democratic Party is running into the hard reality of, we need to get the people on the ground involved and make them feel like they have a stake in this, right? Like that's where you see the grassroots organizing kind of coming in, and it's been successful. It's when we fail to do that where the candidate doesn't win, and when they don't actually listen and take into account the concerns of the people that are voting for them. I think that dynamic is super applicable here as well. It really comes down to meeting people where they are. So I think the area you touched on is imperative for future study, whether it's me or someone else who's kind of doing this work. But just to see examples where organizing has led to change, I think it's key to give the people that are doing this hard, taxing work a tidbit of hope and say, there is a possibility, and it shouldn't fall on them to do this anyway. But that's kind of the system that we've unfortunately been operating under. That they're the people who are going to infiltrate change. It's not going to be the people who have the power to do this with a snap of their fingers. It should be, but
Yeah. Great work. You're a tremendous resource on this topic and certainly one of the thought leaders on it. No question, just as evidenced by today's conversation. So I'd love to keep in touch on this. And, obviously I know you've graduated. Did you like PC? Kind of sidebar. PC has like a weird reputation in the community. Some people are like, oh, it's just rich kids that want to smash up the streets. But then there's also great political, I know just personally from dealing with various professors and other students that there's like a really outstanding political science happening, political science program happening. Did you find it to be a rewarding experience? This is not a commercial. PC did not pay sponsorship for this episode.
No, I really did have a positive experience at PC. Political science was a huge factor in that. My advisors on the project, Dr. Mac Guardino and Dr. Tony Affine, he's like an environmental policy guru in the state of Rhode Island. He's incredible. Dr. Guardino is like a media expert. So just learning from them and my other faculty, I just feel like my intellectual growth was like second to none. And just understanding what I'm passionate about, they helped me kind of understand my like career path. And so that was a huge part. And I would also just say the Public and Community Service Studies program led by Dr. Keith Morton, which I was privileged enough to be a part of. That's where I learned about the community that I was adopting as my community. They actually take you, and I think PC has a reputation as being a bubble for very good reason. The PSP program is the only program really to my knowledge there that takes you into the community, like shows you about organizing, shows you that the neighborhood like isn't as scary as people project it to be. And that made my experience so much more rewarding because you're coming into these people's homes for 4 years. Like this isn't your home. And so for us to understand like asset-based community development and just working with like different partners, I think that was so instrumental and also a huge reason why this project made sense for me, because I felt like I had a better understanding of how to talk to people in a community that I wasn't a part of and understand like my own positionality as a white, relatively privileged college student. And I could create maybe a safer environment than someone who just wants to exploit their narrative. So I definitely understand the reputation that PC has. I had a positive experience, but I would say so much of that is because of the thoughts, the thinkers and the professors that I had like learned from. So yeah.
Yeah. And again, this message not brought to you by Providence College, though if Providence College would like to bring you this message on a regular basis, bill@ripodcast.com. All right. Great stuff. Really appreciate it. And let's keep in touch on it.
Great. Thanks so much, Bill.
Rhode Island's podcast of record, B-Town.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.